There is a question that haunted Michael Jordan for 30 years, not a question about championships, not about rings or records, or whether he was the greatest who ever lived. The question was simpler than that, and far more brutal. It was this: whose man are you? The critics had an answer ready. They said Michael Jordan belonged to Nike, to McDonald's, to Gatorade, to the boardrooms and the ad agencies and the white executives who'd turned a black kid from Wilmington, North Carolina into the most valuable marketing property on the planet. They said Jordan had made a deal, and the deal wasn't just about shoes. They said he had traded his voice, the voice of a generation, the voice of Black America in its most turbulent decade, for the silence that kept everyone's money safe. Jim Brown said it. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar said it. Even Barack Obama, years later, admitted he would have wanted to see Jordan push harder. And for a long time, none of it seemed to matter. Jordan kept winning. Jordan kept selling. Jordan kept smiling in the commercials and refusing to answer the hard questions. But here is what nobody talked about. Here is what got buried under all the sneaker sales and the championship parades and the mythology of Air Jordan. Before Michael Jordan was a marketing product, someone tried to make him one. And the story of how he refused, not with words but with 30 years of calculated, methodical, devastating action, is the story that explains everything. You need to understand where Michael Jordan came from before you can understand what they tried to do to him. Not the highlight reel version. The real version. The version that starts not in Chicago, not in Chapel Hill, but in Wilmington, North Carolina, in a year when the world was a very different and a very dangerous place for a black boy with ambition. Wilmington in the 1970s carried the weight of history in its streets. It was a city that had never forgotten 1898, when a white supremacist mob had overthrown the elected black government of the city in a coup, the only successful coup d'etat in American history, burning homes, killing men in the streets, driving the survivors into the swamps. The Ku Klux Klan had once been stronger in North Carolina than in any other southern state combined. That history didn't disappear just because the calendar changed. It settled into the soil, into the institutions, into the casual cruelties that white children absorbed from their parents and brought to school with them every morning. Michael Jordan was 13 years old in 1976. He was tall for his age, competitive in the way that boys from struggling families often are, as if winning the small battles of childhood could compensate for the larger battles that adults were still losing. He played basketball in the driveway, he played baseball, he fought with his brothers. He was, by all accounts, a normal kid in an abnormal world. And then came the day that changed everything. A girl in his class called him the N-word, not in a whisper, not in a moment of private cruelty that could be explained away. She said it to his face, the way you say something you've said 100 times before, the way you say something you learned at home and never thought to question. Jordan threw a soda at her. He was suspended from school. When his mother, Dolores, came to pick him up, she didn't comfort him the way he expected. She sat him down and told him something he would carry for the rest of his life. Don't let hatred turn you into something you're not. Don't let them make you smaller. Jordan would later say, in a 1992 interview with Playboy magazine, that in that period of his life he considered himself racist. He said he was against all white people. He was 14 years old, burning with a rage he had no outlet for, in a state where the wounds of slavery and Jim Crow were still raw and bleeding under a thin veneer of progress. But here is the thing about Michael Jordan. Here is the thing that the critics who accused him of silence never quite understood. Jordan didn't extinguish that rage. He redirected it. He took everything they threw at him, every slur, every dismissal, every moment when someone looked at him and saw not a person but a category, and he turned it into fuel. He became obsessed with basketball, not despite the racism around him, but partly because of it. On the court, a biographer would later write, nobody could deem him less than or inferior. On the court, the ball went in or it didn't, and nobody's prejudice could change that. The court was the one place in Wilmington, North Carolina, where the rules were the same for everyone. By the time Jordan arrived at the University of North Carolina in 1981, he was already something extraordinary. Dean Smith, who had been coaching the Tar Heels since 1961 and had seen more talent walk through his gym than most men see in 3 lifetimes, recognized it immediately. But Smith also recognized something else. He recognized that Jordan was still that angry kid from Wilmington, still carrying the weight of every slight, still needing to turn every perceived insult into a reason to be better. Smith became one of the most important people in Jordan's life, not just as a coach, but as an architect of character. He taught Jordan that excellence was a form of argument, that the best answer to anyone who doubted you was to be so undeniably, devastatingly good that doubt became impossible. In 1982, as a freshman, Jordan hit the game-winning shot in the NCAA championship against Georgetown. The whole country saw it, and something began to shift in the way America looked at Michael Jordan. But here is what was also shifting, in boardrooms and marketing departments far from the basketball court, in the minds of men who had very little interest in who Jordan was and enormous interest in what he could sell. They were watching too, and they were making calculations. The summer of 1984 was the summer that the machine made its move. Michael Jordan had just finished his junior year at UNC, had just led the United States Olympic team to a gold medal in Los Angeles, and was preparing to enter the NBA draft, where the Chicago Bulls would select him with the 3rd overall pick. He was 21 years old. He had never played a professional game, and he was already being reduced. Reduced is the right word. Because what happened in those negotiations wasn't just business. It was a kind of categorization, a sorting of a human being into a product, a decision made by powerful men in expensive offices about who Michael Jordan was allowed to be and what box he was allowed to fit in. Adidas, which Jordan preferred, he had worn their gear since high school, considered it the serious athlete's brand, barely looked at him. The people at Adidas thought he wasn't tall enough, didn't project the image they were cultivating. Think about that for a moment. The man who would become the greatest basketball player who ever lived, who would transcend the sport to become one of the most recognized faces on the planet. And Adidas looked at him and said, "Not quite right." Converse, which had Larry Bird and Magic Johnson on its roster, offered him $100,000 a year and essentially told him he'd be a supporting act in their established drama. Then there was Nike. Nike in 1984 was not the colossus it would become. It was a running shoe company, trying desperately to break into basketball, burning through money, making bets on players who hadn't panned out. They had a budget of $250,000 to sign 3 or 4 players from the entire draft class. A marketing executive named Sonny Vaccaro, a man who knew basketball the way some men know horses, instinctively, dangerously, convinced the company to put the entire budget on Jordan alone. It was a gamble that everyone in the company thought was insane. Jordan didn't want to go. He had to be persuaded by his parents to even take the meeting. He sat in a room in Beaverton, Oregon, and watched Nike's presentation, and somewhere in that room, watching highlight after highlight of himself set to music, something clicked. Not enthusiasm exactly. Something colder than enthusiasm. Something more like recognition. His agent, David Falk, negotiated a deal that was unprecedented in its structure. 5 years, $2.5 million, plus royalties on every shoe sold with Jordan's name. Royalties. That clause, which Falk and Jordan's mother Dolores pushed for against significant resistance, was the clause that would eventually make Jordan a billionaire. Not the salary, the royalties, the ownership. Even then, even at 21, the people around Michael Jordan were fighting for him to own a piece of what he created. Even then, the machine was trying to take that ownership away. Nike agreed because they thought the royalties were a nice gesture, a detail in a deal they expected to cost them $3 million in shoe sales over 3 years. They did not expect what happened next. Within the first year alone, Air Jordan shoes sold $126 million worth of product. Nike had not sold that many basketball shoes in their entire previous history combined. But here is where the story takes its first dark turn. Because the machine, once it realized what it had, immediately began trying to control it. The NBA, looking at Jordan's black and red Air Jordan shoes in the 1984 preseason, sent Nike a letter. The shoes violated league policy, they said. Uniforms needed to be at least 51% white. The shoes were only 23% white. The NBA would fine Jordan $5,000 every game he wore them. What happened next was either brilliant marketing or a demonstration of exactly what Jordan was up against, depending on how you looked at it. Nike agreed to pay the fines, Nike built an entire advertising campaign around the banned shoes. The commercial showed Jordan holding the shoe, while a narrator said the NBA couldn't stop you from wearing them. It was genius. It was also, underneath the genius, something more uncomfortable. Because what Nike had done was take a rule that applied to a black athlete, use it to their financial advantage, and sell the narrative of rebellion without the athlete having to say anything at all. Jordan became the face of a corporate rebellion he hadn't chosen. His defiance, if it could even be called that since he never defied anything himself, had been packaged and sold before he'd had a chance to decide whether it was his to give. He was 22 years old. He was playing the best basketball anyone had ever seen. He was also, for the first time but not the last, being used. The men who ran the marketing campaigns understood something important about Michael Jordan's commercial appeal. They understood that America in the 1980s was hungry for a particular kind of black celebrity, one who transcended race, who made white consumers feel comfortable, who performed excellence without performing anger. The scholar and author Johnny Smith would later write that Jordan sold a story of racial integration, that his commercials projected a kind of virtual integration, a feeling that white Americans could have meaningful contact with black people without having social interactions with them in real life. Jordan was being turned into something that was useful for everyone's fantasy and accountable to no one's reality. He knew it. He wasn't naive. He had grown up in Wilmington. He had been suspended from school for throwing a soda at a girl who called him the N-word. He understood what was being asked of him when executives told him to smile for the camera and not comment on politics and keep things light, keep things fun, keep things universal. He understood that universal in that context meant something very specific. It meant, don't make white people uncomfortable. Don't remind them that you came from a place where their ancestors built their comfort on your ancestors' suffering. Just fly, just dunk, just be Air Jordan and leave Michael Jordan at home. And for a time, for a long, complicated, carefully calculated time, he did exactly what they asked, but not for the reasons they thought. That is the part the critics never understood. The year 1990 is where you have to look if you want to understand the trap they set for Michael Jordan. Not the trap of exploitation, which had been sprung in 1984 and was operating more efficiently every year. A different trap. A trap made of righteousness. His name was Harvey Gantt. He was black, he was a Democrat. He was the former mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina. And in 1990, he was running for the United States Senate against Jesse Helms, an incumbent Republican who had made his career on a platform that barely disguised its contempt for black Americans. Helms had called the Civil Rights Act of 1964 the single most dangerous piece of legislation ever introduced in the Congress. He had opposed the creation of a national holiday for Martin Luther King Jr. with a ferocity that embarrassed even some of his Republican colleagues. He had built 30 years of political power in North Carolina on the fear and resentment of white voters who watched the world changing and didn't like what they saw. And he was running against a black man, and the polls said it was close, and people came to Michael Jordan and said, now you have to speak. Now you have to choose. Now you have to stop being everybody's Air Jordan and start being Michael Jordan from Wilmington, North Carolina, who knows exactly who Jesse Helms is. Jordan's mother, Dolores, asked him to film a public service announcement for Gantt's campaign. Jordan said he couldn't publicly endorse someone he didn't know well enough. He sent a check instead. And then, somewhere, on a team bus with Horace Grant and Scottie Pippen, according to his own account in The Last Dance documentary, which aired in 2020, he made a joke. The joke was, Republicans buy sneakers too. He said it was thrown off the cuff. He said it was in jest. He said it was never meant to be a public statement or a political philosophy. But the words got out, the way words always get out, and they didn't travel as a joke. They traveled as a confession. They traveled as the most damning thing a man of Jordan's stature could say in 1990, as a sentence that seemed to confirm everything his critics suspected, that Michael Jordan had been so thoroughly consumed by the machine that he would not risk a percentage point of market share to oppose a man who'd spent 3 decades opposing his people. Jim Brown called him out. Brown, who had sacrificed his own career and his own safety in the service of civil rights, who had sat with Muhammad Ali and Bill Russell and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in that famous photograph when Ali refused the draft, said that Jordan's main concern was the demands of corporate America. Brown said Jordan was not being a role model for black people in the proper way. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, years later, said Jordan had taken commerce over conscience. Arthur Ashe, who had used his platform as a tennis champion to speak on apartheid and AIDS and racial inequality, reportedly tried to personally persuade Jordan to support Gantz's campaign. They were not wrong to want more. Helms won that election by 100,000 votes. Nobody could say with certainty that Jordan's endorsement would have changed the outcome. Nobody could say with certainty that it wouldn't have. But here is where the story breaks open. Here is the plot twist that the critics, in their righteous anger, mostly missed. Michael Jordan was not a coward. He was not morally indifferent. He was not, at his core, a marketing executive who happened to be able to dunk. He was a man executing a strategy so long-term, so patient, so methodical, that it would take another 30 years to see it clearly. He had watched what happened to black athletes who spoke. He had watched Muhammad Ali lose 4 years of his prime, his heavyweight title, his livelihood, prosecuted by the United States government for refusing the draft on the grounds of religious conscience and opposition to the Vietnam War. He had watched Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the greatest scorer in NBA history, spend decades as one of the most important public intellectuals on questions of race and justice in America, and watched how the mainstream sports media treated him, at arm's length, with suspicion, as a difficult man, a polarizing figure, despite everything he had achieved. Jordan had grown up watching the ways that black excellence got punished when it came attached to black opinion. He understood the tax, and he had a different plan. It wasn't noble in the conventional sense. It was colder than nobility, more strategic, more patient. He was going to accumulate power, real power, not the power of a spokesman, not the power of a man invited to sit at tables he didn't own, not the power of a celebrity whose opinion was solicited and then gently managed. He was going to build wealth so vast and influence so deep that he would eventually sit at the head of those tables. He would own the teams. He would fund the causes. He would change things not with speeches but with money and ownership and presence in the rooms where decisions were actually made. Whether that plan was correct, whether it justified the silences, whether the ends justified 30 years of careful positioning, is a question that has no clean answer. Jordan himself acknowledged it in The Last Dance. Was that selfish? Probably, he said, talking about his focus on basketball during those years. But that was my energy. He wasn't claiming righteousness. He was claiming clarity of purpose. And somewhere underneath that clarity, if you listened carefully enough, you could still hear Wilmington. You could still hear a 14-year-old boy with a soda can in his hand, his mother's voice telling him not to let them make him smaller, deciding right then in the principal's office, with the humiliation still hot on his face, that he was going to be so much bigger than they could imagine that their smallness would eventually stop being able to reach him. The year 2014 is the year the machine finally showed its hand. Not Jordan's machine, the machine that had been running around him, through him, using him. The machine of white American commerce, which had spent 30 years consuming Jordan's image and selling it back to the world, which had made billions from the idea of Michael Jordan, while occasionally quietly reminding him of his limits. It happened in April, when an audio recording surfaced of Donald Sterling, the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers, speaking to a young woman he was having a relationship with. The recording was ugly in the particular way that private racism is ugly, casual, reflexive, without the effort of performance. Sterling told her he didn't want her bringing black people to Clippers games. He didn't want her posting photographs of herself with black men on social media. He said these things as if they were reasonable, as if they were self-evident, as if the fact that he owned a team in a league where the vast majority of players were black men had nothing to do with him personally, as if ownership was one thing and humanity was another. The NBA's response was swift. Commissioner Adam Silver moved with a decisiveness that surprised almost everyone in the sports world. Sterling was banned from the NBA for life and forced to sell the Clippers. The process was quick, public, and unambiguous. But before the institution acted, Before the commissioner made his statement, Michael Jordan made his. He released a public statement that he had written himself. He was at the time the owner of the Charlotte Bobcats, the only black majority owner in the NBA. Jordan said there was no room in the NBA or anywhere else for the kind of racism and hatred that Sterling had expressed. He said he was completely outraged. He said he was appalled that this type of ignorance still existed within the country and at the highest levels of sport. And then he said something that deserves to be heard carefully by everyone who had spent 20 years calling him silent. In a league where the majority of players are African American, we cannot and must not tolerate discrimination at any level. We, not they. We. Jordan was speaking as an owner, as a decision-maker, as a man inside the institution with the power to change it, not as a celebrity standing outside it, asking to be heard. He had done exactly what he said he was going to do. He had built his way to a seat at the table that mattered. And when the moment came, when the racism wasn't abstract, wasn't political, wasn't a calculation about Senate races and sneaker sales, but was right there in plain language, right there in the institution he was part of, he didn't hesitate. But the story doesn't end with a statement. It doesn't end in 2014. Because what Jordan had been building in the decades of his supposed silence was something far more substantial than a press release. He had been getting black executives hired and promoted inside Nike and Jordan Brand and his Charlotte franchise. Quietly, without announcements, doing the work that changes organizations from within. He had given $5 million as a founding donor to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He had hosted fundraisers for Barack Obama. He had, as it emerged years later, contributed financially to Harvey Gantt's 1996 campaign, the second time Gantt ran against Helms after the furore over his silence in 1990. He had built Jordan Brand's university partnerships to include Howard University, a historically black institution. He had been doing all of this without the press conferences, without the endorsements, without the speeches that would have felt good in the moment and accomplished a fraction of what the money and the ownership accomplished over decades. In 2016, after the killings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile by police officers, Jordan broke his silence on social issues in a way that could not be dismissed as a quiet check written behind closed doors. He wrote a column for The Undefeated, a sports and culture platform focused on race. In it, he talked about his personal pain watching black men die at the hands of police. He talked about growing up in North Carolina in the shadow of that history. He talked about the silence he had maintained and why he was choosing to break it. And he announced 2 donations of $1 million each, one to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, one to the Institute for Community Police Relations. $2 million. Not a statement of political neutrality, not a calculation about market share. A choice. The critics, when Jordan made that choice, found themselves in an unexpected position. Some said it was too little too late. Some said Jordan had only spoken when it was safe to speak, when the cultural moment made silence commercially riskier than speech. There is something to that argument. The world of 2016 was not the world of 1990. LeBron James and other athletes of his generation had made political speech not just acceptable but expected for black athletes at the highest level of the sport. But here is the counter-argument, and it is one that Jordan made himself, calmly, without defensiveness. In the moments when people asked him directly, look at what he had built. Look at where he was standing. Look at the seat he was occupying, and calculate what it would have cost to occupy it while being the man his critics wanted him to be. The journalist and scholar Johnny Smith, who wrote Jumpman, put it with precision that Jordan himself might not have used. Jordan made deliberate decisions about how to remain silent around issues of race so he could maintain his universal popularity. But in the long run, Jordan leveraged his relationships with corporate America to become a billionaire and the first black majority owner of an NBA team. Had he been an outspoken civil rights figure in the 1980s and 1990s, he would not have had the same access to the wealth that allowed him to become a pioneer as part of the sport's ruling class. It was not a comfortable truth. It was not the kind of truth that produces inspiring speeches or statue dedications. It was the truth of a man who had looked at the world as it actually was, not as it should have been, and made decisions accordingly. Whether those decisions were right is something that reasonable people can disagree about. What they cannot disagree about is that they were decisions, not failures, not cowardice, decisions, made by a man who had been thinking about racism and power, and how to survive both since he was 14 years old in a Wilmington school, staring at a girl who had just told him exactly what she thought he was. There is something that happens when a great story finally arrives at its ending. The pieces that seemed disconnected, the soda can in the principal's office, the Adidas rejection, the Nike shoe ban, the Harvey Gantt silence, the Donald Sterling statement, the $2 million donation, suddenly arranged themselves into a shape that was always there, waiting to be seen. The shape of a man who was always in the fight, who was never, not for a single year, simply a marketing product, who understood the fight better than his critics, perhaps, because he had been inside it longer and at far higher stakes. By the time he spoke in 2016, the portrait was almost complete. His net worth carried the royalties clause that Dolores Jordan had insisted upon in 1984, the clause that turned a shoe deal into a dynasty, that made her son not just the face of Nike's basketball division, but the owner of a brand that generated more than $2.5 billion in annual sales, more money every year, than Jordan earned in his entire playing career combined. The Jumpman logo, that silhouette of him mid-flight, arms spread, defying gravity, was everywhere. On shoes, on hats, on the uniforms of college teams and professional players, on the walls of bedrooms in Brazil and China and France and Nigeria. Everywhere you looked, in the global visual language of athletic aspiration, there was Michael Jordan, frozen in the moment before the ball left his hand, before gravity reasserted itself, suspended between what was and what was possible. He was the first black majority owner of an NBA franchise. He had gotten there by accumulating the kind of wealth that changes what rooms you're allowed to enter and what decisions you're allowed to make. He had not gotten there by being silent in the way his critics describe silence, passive, indifferent, complicit. He had gotten there by being quiet in the way a surgeon is quiet before an operation, focused, purposeful, unwilling to spend energy on gestures when the same energy could change structures. In The Last Dance, the 2020 ESPN documentary that gave Jordan the chance to tell his own story in his own voice, he addressed the Harvey Gantt question one final time. He didn't apologize. He explained. He said he had never thought of himself as an activist. He said he thought of himself as a basketball player. And then, with a precision that his critics often underestimated, he identified the thing that was actually being asked of him when people demanded his political endorsement. Everybody has a preconceived idea for what I should do and what I shouldn't do. He paused. The way I go about my life is I set examples. He paused again. If it inspires you, great. That sentence landed differently depending on where you were standing when you heard it. If you were standing with the civil rights lawyers and the activists who wanted Jordan to be Ali, it sounded like a deflection. But if you were standing with the black executives who got hired at Jordan Brand because Jordan insisted on it, if you were standing with the students at Howard University whose athletic program received the Jordan Brand partnership that changed what resources they had access to, if you were standing with the people whose organizations received $2 million in 2016 when the country needed it most, if you were standing in any of those places, that sentence sounded less like a deflection and more like an answer. A quiet answer. An answer given in the language of results rather than rhetoric. This is the thing about Michael Jordan and racism that the surface version of the story always missed. The surface version said Jordan was reduced to a marketing product and he accepted it, and his acceptance was a betrayal. The real version is harder to hold and more honest in its difficulty. Jordan was never fully reduced. The machine tried. The Adidas executives who thought he wasn't the right image, the NBA officials who wanted his shoes to be 51% white, the marketing strategists who needed him to be transcendently race-neutral, the critics who wanted him to be transcendently race-conscious, all of them tried to define who Jordan was allowed to be. And Jordan absorbed all of their definitions and refused all of them, not in public, not in press conferences, but in the patient, infuriating, awe-inspiring way that he refused everything he didn't want to accept, by quietly becoming something they hadn't imagined. The boy from Wilmington who threw a soda at a girl who called him the N-word became the man whose name generates $2.5 billion a year. The young man who was told by Adidas that he wasn't quite right became the athlete whose silhouette is one of the most recognizable images on the planet. The player who was told his shoes were the wrong color became the owner of a franchise, sitting at tables where the rules of the sport are made. The man who was accused of trading his voice for his brand used that brand to fund the legal defense of Black Americans, to build the museum that tells the story of African American history, to invest in the causes that his critics said he had abandoned. None of this absolves the silences. None of this erases the complexity of watching Jesse Helms go back to the Senate in 1990 while Michael Jordan sent a quiet check and said nothing. History doesn't come with that kind of clean erasure. What it comes with, if you look long enough, is a fuller picture. And the fuller picture of Michael Jordan and race is not the picture of a man who chose commerce over conscience. It is the picture of a man who understood, from Wilmington, from the principal's office, from Adidas turning him away, from the NBA trying to ban his shoes, from 30 years of being told who he was supposed to be, that in the world as it actually existed, you didn't change things by talking about changing them. You changed things by being so undeniably, devastatingly present at the center of power that the power had no choice but to renegotiate. He had learned that lesson at 14. He had been practicing it ever since. And if there are moments in your life when someone tells you who you are, when someone looks at you and sees a category instead of a person, when the world tries to put you in a box and hand you a script and tell you to smile for the camera, then Michael Jordan's story is yours too. Not because his answers are the right answers, not because his silences were justified, but because the question underneath everything he did, whose definition of you are you going to accept, is the question that everyone who has ever been reduced to something smaller than they are has had to answer for themselves. Jordan answered it over 30 years, in courts and boardrooms and donation records and quiet conversations, and $2 million checks and the name of a shoe that became a symbol. He answered it in the only language he fully trusted, not words, results. And when the final count was taken, when the machine looked up from its spreadsheets and realized what had happened, realized that the marketing product it thought it had purchased had become one of the most powerful men in the sport, had become the first black majority owner of an NBA franchise, had built a brand that outlasted every other athlete brand in history. The silence that fell over those boardrooms was the most eloquent thing Michael Jordan ever said. If you've stayed with this story until the end, then you already understand something about yourself. You understand that the long game is real, that the people who change things aren't always the ones shouting loudest, that the most powerful answer to those who try to reduce you is to grow so undeniably large that reduction becomes impossible. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And come back, because the stories we tell here are the ones they don't put in the highlight reels, the ones that happen in the space between the dunks, where character is actually built.